The stone was sealed, not wax, not rope, not a symbol of preference or courtesy. The seal on the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth was a mark of official Roman authority, the same kind of mark that sealed legal documents in the ancient world, the same kind of mark that sealed the lion's den in the book of Daniel so that no one could alter the sentence. To break that seal was not a trespass, it was a capital crime. The guards standing before it were not ceremonial. They were not temple attendants in linen robes holding incense. They were trained men, deployed at the explicit request of the most powerful religious institution in Judea, authorized by the Roman governor of the province himself. Their job was simple and total. Make sure the body stays inside. The night air over Jerusalem smelled of torchlight and limestone and the last traces of Passover smoke. The city was quiet in the way that cities are quiet after something enormous has happened and most people do not yet know what to do with it. 2 days earlier, a man had been executed on the hill north of the city walls. The crowds had dispersed. The disciples were behind locked doors. The Sabbath had passed, and the chief priests could not sleep. It was the Saturday after the Crucifixion, the morning before the first day of the week, and what happened in the hours and days that followed would produce the most unexpected argument in the history of this story, built not by the followers of Jesus, but by his enemies. Today we are going to examine what the guards of the tomb reveal, not as a devotional reflection, as a piece of first-century historical evidence. And what we are going to find is that the chief priests, the guards, and the system of authority that crucified Jesus built, without intending to, the most objective argument available for the resurrection they were trying to prevent. The visuals in this video are created with artificial intelligence, reconstructions of a world that no longer exists, built from the archaeological and historical record. The technology is new. The evidence is 2,000 years old. Forget the passive image of the resurrection story that most people carry. The quiet garden, the grieving women, the disciples waiting in confusion. That picture is real, but it is only half the canvas. The other half of the canvas is this. On the Saturday between the crucifixion and the resurrection, the chief priests of Jerusalem were moving, urgently, in violation of their own religious law. Mathew 27 verse 62. The next day, the one after Preparation Day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. The day after Preparation Day. Preparation Day was Friday, the day before the Sabbath, when Jewish households completed all their work before the mandatory rest began. The day after Preparation Day was the Sabbath itself, the seventh day, the day the law of Moses commanded to be kept holy, the day on which no public business was to be conducted. That is the day the chief priests went to the residence of the Roman governor. This detail is not incidental. In the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 31, these same chief priests had invoked the sanctity of the Sabbath as the urgent reason to take the bodies down from the crosses before sundown. For that Sabbath was a high day. The Sabbath was so important that the bodies could not remain on the crosses through it. And yet on that same high Sabbath, the chief priests walked to the praetorium to request a military guard for a dead man's tomb. They violated the rest they had enforced on the crucifixion victims because they were afraid of what might happen to a man who was already dead. Matthew 27 verses 63 and 64. Sir, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, "After 3 days I will rise. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first," we remember. The Greek verb used here is mnesthemen. We have retained this, we have held it in mind, not a passing thought, a processed one. The chief priests had heard Jesus' prediction of his resurrection, had deliberated over it, and had arrived at Pilate's door with a specific response to a specific timeline. They knew the prediction was about the third day. Matthew 27:64 asks for the tomb to be secured until the third day. Not indefinitely, not for a week, but until the third day. The window of time was precise because the prediction they were responding to was precise. And notice who believed the resurrection prediction seriously enough to act on it before it happened. It was not the disciples. Luke 24:21, the disciples on the road to Emmaus. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. We had hoped. Past tense, the hope was dead. They were not expecting anything to happen on Sunday morning. The chief priests were. They took Jesus' words about the resurrection more seriously than the people who had spent 3 years walking with him. And they were right to take them seriously. The ones who posted the guard knew what was going to happen. The ones who should have known did not. Matthew 27:65. Pilate answered, "Take a guard. Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." In the original Greek, eket koustodia, you have a guard. The word koustodia is a Latin loanword, custodia, meaning guard or custody. And the question of exactly who these guards were has direct implications for understanding what happened when the tomb was found empty. The argument among historians and commentators centers on two possibilities: Roman soldiers assigned directly by Pilate, or temple guards who already served under the authority of the chief priests. The linguistic evidence points toward temple guards. First, the phrase Pilate uses, "you have a guard," reads more naturally as an acknowledgement that the chief priests already had their own guards available, not as an assignment of new soldiers. The present tense suggests an existing resource, not a fresh deployment. Second, and more decisive, Matthew 28:11 says that when the guards reported what had happened, they went to the city and reported to the chief priests, not to Pilate. Roman soldiers assigned by the governor of the province have a direct obligation to report to their Roman superior. The fact that these guards went first to the chief priests indicates that their institutional loyalty was Jewish, not Roman. Third, verse 14 of chapter 28 is the most revealing. The chief priests promise the guards, "If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." If these were Roman soldiers, that promise would be absurd. But if they were temple guards, Jewish institutional officers who had become involved in a situation that reached the Roman governor, then the promise of mediation makes complete sense. The scholarly consensus among those who study this text in detail, including commentators like D.A. Carson and Craig Keener, concludes, temple guards of Jewish authority, not soldiers of the Roman legion, which means that when the tomb was found empty, the institutional responsibility for explaining what had happened fell directly on the same religious system that had executed Jesus. Matthew 27:66, so they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard, sealing the stone. In Greek, sphragisantis ton liton. The verb sphragizo means to seal with an official mark of authority, the same word used for sealing legal documents, the same word used in Daniel chapter 6 when the king sealed the lion's den so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. In the ancient world, a seal was not decoration. It was a legal signature. Breaking the seal was not trespassing. It was a formal act of defiance against whatever authority had placed it. The seal on the tomb of Jesus carried the authority of the chief priests, and implicitly, since the guard had been arranged through Pilate's cooperation, the authority of Rome. To move that stone without authorization was a capital offense under both systems, and the stone was moved. Matthew 28 verses 2 through 4, there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. Note what the text does not say. It does not say the stone was moved so that Jesus could exit. The resurrection body of Jesus did not require a physical opening to move. The same body that appeared in the upper room with the doors locked, according to John 20:19, needed no passage through stone. The stone was moved for the witnesses outside, so that those approaching from the city could enter and see that the tomb was empty. The removal of the stone was for those on the outside, not for the one who had been inside. And no one was prosecuted for breaking the seal. The chief priests who had placed the seal had full authority to investigate and prosecute whoever had violated it. If the stolen body story had been true, they had every legal mechanism and every motivation available to act. They did not act. Because the violator of the seal, according to the report of their own guards, was an angel of the Lord, and that was not an accusation they could file with Pilate. Stop here for a moment, because what follows is not a coincidence of language. It is a deliberate connection that Matthew built for his Jewish audience. Matthew 28 verse 4, the guards shook and became like dead men. In Greek, egenetesan hose nekroi, they became as dead ones. This phrase does not appear in Mark. It does not appear in Luke. It does not appear in John. Only Matthew uses it. And it appears in one other significant place in the Hebrew Scriptures. Daniel 10 verses 7 through 9. I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. So I was left alone, gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale and I was helpless. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. The men beside Daniel, overwhelmed by terror, fled, hid. Daniel himself, left without strength, face to the ground like dead men. Matthew, writing for a Jewish audience that knew the Hebrew Scriptures deeply, uses the same image from Daniel 10 to describe the guards before the angel of the resurrection. This is not accidental word choice. This is deliberate construction. The event at the tomb has the same cosmic category as Daniel's visions of the end of the age. Daniel saw the messenger of the end times and fell like a dead man. The guards before the tomb of Jesus saw the messenger of the resurrection and became like dead men. Matthew is communicating through the grammar of the text, through the echo of Daniel, that what happened at that tomb on Sunday morning belongs to the category of direct divine intervention in history, with consequences that extend beyond a single moment in a single city. The historian N.T., right in his landmark work, The Resurrection of the Son of God, develops this point at length. In first-century Judaism, the idea of an individual resurrection before the general resurrection of the dead, before the end-of-age event described in Daniel 12, was theologically inconceivable. The category simply did not exist in the conceptual map of the period. What this means for the historical analysis, if the disciples had wanted to invent a story, the individual physical resurrection of Jesus was the last story they would have chosen to invent. No one chooses to invent something that breaks the conceptual categories of their own audience. The disciples proclaimed what they proclaimed because they found the tomb empty and encountered the risen Jesus, not because they selected the most implausible story available for launching a religious movement. The ones who posted the guard knew what was going to happen. The ones who should have known did not. Matthew 28 verses 11 through 15. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. 3 logical problems in the story they paid to have repeated. Not theological problems, logical problems that any lawyer in any court of the ancient world would have identified in 10 minutes. First problem, sleep as testimony in Roman law. The story says, "His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep." In the Roman military system, a soldier who falls asleep on guard duty faces the fustuarium, a punishment in which his fellow soldiers beat him to death. The Roman military writer Vegetius documents this in De Re Militari. Sleeping on post was not a disciplinary infraction, it was an execution offense. The chief priests knew this. It is precisely why they immediately add the promise of protection. They were asking the guards to confess to an offense that carried the death penalty. Second problem, the testimony of the sleeping witness while we were asleep. If the guards were asleep, how do they know what happened? How did they identify the perpetrators as the disciples specifically? A Roman court, operating under the legal tradition that produced Cicero's legal orations, would not accept testimony about events that occurred during the witness's own sleep. No legal system in the ancient Mediterranean world treats that as evidence. Third problem, the most definitive, the body. In Acts chapter 2, 50 days after the crucifixion, Peter preached the resurrection in Jerusalem. Not in Rome, not in Alexandria, in Jerusalem, the same city where the crucifixion had occurred, where the chief priests held full authority, where the witnesses of the trial were still alive, where the tomb was accessible. Peter said, "God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it," Acts 2:32. The simplest, most devastating, most final response to that sermon would have been, "Produce the body." The chief priests had the authority, the access, the resources, and the most powerful motivation imaginable. If the body was somewhere, stolen, hidden, relocated, producing it would have ended the movement in a single afternoon. They never produced the body. Not on the day of Peter's sermon, not in the weeks following, not in the months that followed, not in the decades during which the movement spread through Judea, Samaria, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome. The historical record contains no account of the chief priests ever presenting a body, or any part of a body, or any evidence of a body, in response to the proclamation of the resurrection. The silence is absolute. The only coherent explanation for why the most powerful religious institution in Judea never produced the body of a man they had publicly executed 50 days earlier is that the body was not available to be produced. The ones who posted the guard knew what was going to happen. The ones who should have known did not. Let us hold the complete chain together now, because the argument for the resurrection that emerges from Matthew 27 and 28 is built almost entirely from the actions of the people who were trying to prevent it. First, the chief priests requested a guard for the tomb, citing Jesus' own prediction of his resurrection. This confirms that the resurrection prediction was known, taken seriously, and acted upon by the opponents of Jesus before the event occurred. Second, the tomb was found empty on Sunday morning. This is affirmed by all four Gospels and was not contradicted by the Jewish authorities in any document of the period. The chief priests did not respond by saying the tomb was not empty. They responded by fabricating an explanation for why it was empty. The emptiness of the tomb was not disputed. The cause of the emptiness was. Third, the chief priests never produced the body. Given full authority, full access, full motivation, and 50 days in which the movement was growing in their own city, they never produced the body or any evidence of a body. Fourth, the chief priests fabricated and paid to circulate an alternative explanation. The fact that the explanation had three fundamental logical problems means it was the best available, not what they would have chosen if better options existed. Fifth, the fabricated explanation circulated for decades, and during those decades, the movement it was designed to refute kept growing in the same city, with the same witnesses alive, with the same tomb accessible. The historian Tacitus, writing around 110 AD, mentions Christus as the founder of the Christian movement, executed in the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Tacitus was not a Christian. He had no reason to embellish the account. His reference confirms the historical framework. The execution occurred, and the movement that began after the execution was visible enough in Rome, decades later, to be mentioned by one of the most rigorous historians of the ancient world. The apologist Justin Martyr, writing around 150 AD, documents that the stolen body story was still being actively circulated in his period. 150 years after the resurrection, someone was still paying to keep the fabricated story alive, which means the movement it was designed to silence was still sufficiently threatening to justify the ongoing maintenance of a counter-narrative. The best available counter-argument had three logical problems that a first-century court would have rejected. That is not evidence that the resurrection did not occur. It is evidence that there was no better counter-argument, because the tomb was empty and the body was not available. The account of the guards of the tomb appears only in Matthew, not in Mark, not in Luke, not in John. Only Matthew, the gospel written for a Jewish audience, structured to demonstrate from the Hebrew scriptures that Jesus is the promised Messiah, includes this episode. The strongest evidence for the empty tomb was built by the people who had the most reason to prove it was not empty, and the most resources to do so. The ones who posted the guard knew what was going to happen. The ones who should have known did not. Jerusalem woke on that Sunday morning, not yet knowing what the empty tomb meant. The women arrived first, before the rest of the city stirred, with spices prepared for a body that was no longer there. The guards were already gone, making their way toward the chief priests with a report they did not know how to frame. The disciples were still behind locked doors. The city was going about its mourning. And here we are 2,000 years later, in possession of the same facts. The sealed tomb, the empty tomb, the missing body, the fabricated story with three logical problems, the silence that never produced the refutation most needed. What we do with those facts is a different kind of question, but they deserve the same honesty we give to any other piece of first-century evidence. If you arrived at this video with genuine difficulty believing in the resurrection, not because of dishonesty, but because the claim is the most extraordinary in the history of any religion, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, then what the guards of the tomb offer you is this: the contemporaries most motivated to disprove the resurrection with the greatest institutional resources available could not perform the simplest and most definitive refutation. They could not produce the body. That is not a proof that compels belief, but it is evidence that merits serious attention. If you arrived carrying a faith in the resurrection that has become inert, affirmed on Easter Sunday and stored away until next April, then consider what the resurrection produced in the people who encountered it first. Peter, who had denied knowing Jesus 3 times before a servant girl in a courtyard, was standing in Jerusalem 50 days later, proclaiming the resurrection before the same authorities who had authorized the execution. That transformation is not explained by a doctrine affirmed on Sundays. It is explained by an encounter that produced irreversible conviction. And if you arrived carrying a promise that has not yet arrived, something God said that the silence of time has made harder to hold, then consider what the chief priests did. They took Jesus' words about the third day more seriously than his own disciples, seriously enough to violate the Sabbath, seriously enough to go to Pilate, seriously enough to post a guard and seal a stone. And what Jesus said he would do, he did. On the third day, exactly as he had said. The road to the presence of God is open. It has been open since Sunday morning in a garden outside the northern wall of Jerusalem, when a stone sealed by the authority of the chief priests and the cooperation of Rome was moved from the outside, so that everyone approaching from the city could see that what had been inside was no longer there. The ones who posted the guard knew what was going to happen. The ones who should have known did not. And what happened could not be contained by the guard, by the seal, by the money, by the fabricated story, or by the 2,000 years that have passed since that morning. The ones who posted the guard knew what was going to happen. The ones who should have known did not. Does that detail change anything for you? Leave it in the comments. We read every one. Subscribe to Hidden Scripture so you don't miss the next episode. We are walking through the world of the Bible, one event at a time, one city at a time, one piece of evidence at a time. And if there is someone in your life who has questions about the resurrection that deserve more than a Sunday school answer, share this with them, not because it is a video, because the question deserves a serious response, and the enemies of Jesus built one without meaning to.